Sorry, I was muted. Welcome, everyone. So thank you so much for joining the session, A Seat at the Table, Inclusive Election Advocacy. This is a 1-hour session from 2:30 to 3:30. My name is Candice. I use she, her pronouns. I am a policy analyst at the Ontario Nonprofit Network, and I will be moderating the session today. Please feel free to also introduce yourselves in the chat box as well. I would like to begin our session by acknowledging the land that we're meeting on today. We're gathered today on the unceded and unsurrendered land that has been inhabited by Indigenous people from time immemorial. I am joining you today from the ONN office at the Foundation House, located on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. We offer our gratitude and solidarity to the Indigenous people who have and continue to care for, protect, and defend this land. So for today's session, please feel free to pop any questions you have in the chat box throughout our conversation, and we will answer them towards the end of the session. And now I would like to invite our brilliant panelists today to briefly introduce themselves, and then I will return to set the context for the session before we dive into our conversation. So Sabreena, can I invite you to go first if you would like to just briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Candice. Hi, everyone. My name is Sabreena Delhon, and I'm the Executive Director of the Samara Center for Democracy. The Samara Center is a nonpartisan charity dedicated to strengthening democracy in Canada. So our goal is to make Canadian politics more accessible, responsive, and inclusive. And we do this with research and programs that take a critical look at Parliament, political parties, and civic engagement.
Kojo, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you. My name is Kojo Damptey. I'm the Executive Director at the Hamilton Center for Civic Inclusion. And HCCI for short has been in existence since 2001. The main purpose of the organization is to address systemic racism here in Hamilton and sometimes the broader province of Ontario. By doing that through community engagement, civic inclusion, we have a number of programs right now. Our Black Youth Mentorship Program, we run conferences around anti-racism and provide anti-oppression and anti-racism training for organizations here in Hamilton.
Thank you. And Samanta?
Hi, everyone. My name is Samanta Krishnapillai. My pronouns are she and her. I am an accidental entrepreneur in the social justice place of, I created an Instagram account that we're now scaling into a social enterprise. That's goal is to give people the information they need to dismantle the status quo, because the status quo in Canada can't continue and we need change. And I think the first step towards that is making sure we're all operating with the same set of information and understanding about a lot of these systemically woven issues. The project is called On Canada Project. You can check it out on Instagram or on our website on canadaproject.ca. And I am super pumped to be here and share space with all of you, as well as Kojo and Sabreena. You guys are really awesome, and I'm really pumped to be here.
Thank you, everyone. And before we dive into our conversation with our panelists, I would like to just set the context for today's conversation. So as many of us already know, in Ontario, we have the provincial and municipal elections coming up in 2022. And it provides great opportunities for nonprofits to leverage to benefit the communities that they support. Nonprofits play such an important role in engaging communities in debates on public policy issues, especially issues that directly impact the communities they serve. However, at the same time, many communities that nonprofits serve face significant barriers to entering the political process and those conversations. So increasing the participation of those communities will amplify the voices of both the organizations as well as the communities they serve. And so with that, today we'll talk about some of the challenges and barriers different communities might face in political participation and the conversation around public policy issues, as well as what can we do as nonprofits to engage the communities we serve in a more meaningful and inclusive way. So Sabreena, could I invite you to go first? I know Samara did some analysis of the federal election that just took place not long ago. Any lessons or insights from that you would like to share with the audience?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start by sharing that Samara's audience is quite broad. It includes active citizens, public leaders, as well as educators, academics, and journalists. So, very likely who's at nonprofit driven, that gives you a good cross section of people who are connected to the work we do. So in the federal election, what we had on our minds was the fact that toxicity of online political conversations is a barrier to civic engagement. And the research shows that people in our society don't feel safe sharing their political views online, and that results in them avoiding the political conversation altogether. And we know that online toxicity is a key reason for why people leave politics or hold back from moving into the space, even when they're very capable of being leaders there. So in the federal election, we were interested in getting some data and measuring the toxicity problem. And so we used a bot called SAM to track tweets received by incumbent candidates and party leaders. And I'll just share a little bit of the data that we collected during that time because it paints a picture. So over 5 weeks, Sam analyzed over 2 million tweets that were coming at just 300 accounts. And 20% of those tweets qualified as toxic, 1 in 5. And Sam makes predictions about whether someone will perceive a message to be toxic or not. And Sam can look at millions of tweets and distinguish one that is just mean, because, there's always like a little bit of meanness on Twitter, but it can also tell the difference between one that has an identity attack or is threatening or profane. In the first week of the election, we analyzed 350,000 tweets, and 7% of those were severely toxic, so they would have gotten blocked or reported. That's a small number. But it amounts to 25,000 tweets, and they were not equally coming at those 300 accounts. It was very disproportionate, coming at just a handful. In the last week of the campaign, we captured 500,000 tweets, and just in that 1 week alone, 4% of those tweets were sexually explicit. And again, that sounds like a really small number, but it turns into 20,000 tweets coming at just a handful of accounts in 7 days. So this is the circumstance. This is the state of the online political conversation, and navigating this kind of digital vitriol is just a reality for candidates and their staffers. It's going to wear anyone down, and it really takes a toll on the electorate. It keeps people away from participating in the political conversation. It affects who enters politics, it affects who stays in politics, and it affects our sense of representation in our democracy as well, not just our sense of it, but the fact of it. So with Sambot, what we were doing was we measured the obvious, but it resonated because we all know that online toxicity is a problem of our era, and it's taking a toll on our democracy. And in order to address it, what's needed is not just policy change, but also culture change that is inclusive as well.
Thank you very much, Sabreena. That was very informative. And Kojo, the next municipal election for the city of Hamilton is October 24th, 2022. So with that in mind, what are some of the challenges and barriers look like at a local context? And what are some of the ways that we can address those challenges and barriers?
Yeah, I think Sabreena talked about, one of the challenges of any election, whether it's municipal, provincial, or federal, is participation. I think the numbers from this year's federal election, I think it was in the 50s, which is also very low. Municipal politics is always low. It's around the 30s. You're lucky if it's even 40 or 50. So what that means is that there's a large segment of our population that is not participating. So then that means that our democracy is not healthy. And when we talk about who is not participating, I think Sabreena talked about, women, racialized women, women that might be living with disabilities. There are also other racialized populations that do not participate, people with disabilities. And so from our perspective, we are trying to get those populations to speak to the things that they are concerned, and whether the people that are going to run for office are going to respond to the things that they want to talk about, they are interested in. And I think that's one thing that HCCI has been trying to do, because in the past we just assume that anybody running for politics understands the full breadth of all the challenges that many people are facing, but that's not the case, right? I think the Samara Center did some analysis. I think it was the previous election around, what is the profession of members of parliament, and I think it found out that majority of them were lawyers. Well, I don't want to disparage anyone for being a lawyer, but I think there are certain things that lawyers may not understand, even when it comes to how the law impacts racialized and marginalized people. So I think one example here is the clearing of snow. That's a municipal jurisdiction. And if we have elected officials that do not understand the importance of clearing snow on the sidewalks to allow people with disabilities and mobility challenges the time to move through the city, then that becomes an issue. So I think we have to start looking at how we create a participatory political way to engage people, as opposed to just saying, well, you know what, this is how we've done it, and that's how we're going to do it. I think we have to create the interventions and try and engage people into the electoral process and after the electoral process.
Kojo, would you like to dive a bit deeper and give some examples of what are some of the ways that you can engage those communities that you talked about who've been traditionally left out, or whose voices have not been heard by politicians? If you would like to maybe elaborate a bit more on that.
Yeah, so I'll give 3 examples. The first is, there's a great organization called the Democratic Engagement Exchange. They usually do vote pop-ups during the federal election to engage the general public. We've done work with them here in Hamilton. We did some training with some non-for-profits here in Hamilton so that they could get people that work with them to go out and vote. This past election, we also held some roundtables with a number of non-for-profit organizations to talk about specific issues. So systemic racism, issues facing people that live in poverty, or disability justice. We wanted to be specific, because if you are not specific, you are not going to get the answers that you need. And then I think one thing that needs to also that we have to talk about is electoral reform. There's a great organization called Rank Ballot that's also talked about. We need to change the first past the post system, and we should maybe be talking about rank balloting, which in London, rank balloting allowed for racialized women to participate, and it also allowed other marginalized populations to participate. So I think those are some of the three examples that I can share.
Thank you very much for sharing. And Sam, you've done a lot of work around engaging millennials and Gen Z in the political participation. So yeah, would you like to share some of the challenges and barriers faced by those populations and ways to address it?
Yeah, I think I'm increasingly impressed. So for context, I started the On Canada project, which is a social media account the goal is to give millennials and Gen Z the information you need to dismantle the status quo, or disrupt the status quo, dismantle white supremacy. And when we started it around creating information about COVID, because it wasn't simply explained. Like a politician or a leader talking about, you should isolate in your house and you shouldn't touch these things, like those examples, as someone who studied the health sector and health sciences, I was like, yeah, that I know why they're saying that. That makes sense to me that they're saying this. But there were so many of my friends, my intelligent, brilliant friends, who could explain cryptocurrency to me, but I can't explain that type of stuff to them. They didn't understand why our leaders were making these instructions. So we started the account to plainly explain information because everyone deserves access to that information. And then we realized that this wasn't like an isolated thing with COVID, it's pretty much everything. And if we could give people the information that they need, they would take action and they would mobilize around it, or at least have the opportunity to. If you don't know something, it's hard to care about it. And like volunteering, as well as being able to keep up with politics is a privilege. I think of my parents. When I was younger, our family didn't have a lot of money. There's no way my dad and my mom could have done all the work that they had to do as new citizens in this country, and working multiple jobs and taking care of their parents and raising 2 kids, and then come home and be like, let me learn about an entirely different government structure and figure out what to do. They weren't set up for success to engage in that. So it's a privilege to be able to engage in it. And what that does for young people like me who are racialized is that might mean that I'm not growing up in a family that's politically engaged. So you end up being like, I don't really care. Until, I was lucky enough to be able to go to university and engage in student government and therefore got into this type of stuff, but that's not true for everybody. And that's not their fault. If we want young people to engage in politics, maybe teach us something for more than 2 months in high school. Maybe embed it into the way that we show up and promote and ideas of like engaging and disrupting and challenging systems, because isn't that what we want? We want future generations to challenge what we're doing now to make it better and to keep doing that over and over again. So I think the challenge really isn't young people. It's how are we giving them the opportunities to show up in a way that's meaningful, show up in a way that has them informed, and show up in a way that makes them feel like a valued member of what's going on. And I don't really think that is currently the case, and which is why our project focused quite a bit on giving people simple language explanations to what the government was responsible for, why you should engage, why not voting is a vote for the status quo. And I think that we saw such high engagement in our election content because there's an appetite for this stuff. It's just not accessible and it's not available, and it like shouldn't have to require like a poli-sci minor. So I think that like young people are ready to engage in this. It's just we don't have those opportunities. And when we are lucky enough to step into spaces and engage in political conversations or political, like someone's running or on a campaign team, we're often given the job of like social media coordinator or youth engagement, as if that's the only area that we're experts on. But we're like real smart, everybody. Like we're smart people, and you should use us throughout your systems in the same way that you wouldn't have like a cohort of just one demographic working together. You should invite and like integrate young people throughout everything you're doing. And I think that we need to start taking these sort of intergenerational approaches to policymaking, as well as intersectional policymaking, for the change that we want to see in the world.
Candice, I wonder if I can just add on to Samanta's comment.
Yeah, for sure.
I think, Samanta, you really identified like the intergenerational civic engagement problem we have in Canada. If you come from a family where the adults don't vote, it's not necessarily because they have no respect or regard for democracy. It's often because they hesitate to take up civic space because there's an implicit understanding that they're not meant to. And Kojo, to build on what you were saying, if you go to law school, if you become a lawyer, chances are you were raised in a professional family and you're very comfortable taking up civic space. You're very comfortable knowing what your rights are. And you might even think your sense of entitlement is your right. And, that is often what perpetuates the status quo about who's in charge and how decisions get made and what tools and approaches we use to approach complex problems. So I think it's really important for us to kind of go upstream when we have conversations about civic engagement. It's not just about who are you going to vote for or what political party do you identify with. There's so much conditioning, messaging, and hesitation that is kind of baked into our experience as people in Canada, whether they're citizens or not. And I think coming out of the pandemic with our kind of renewed mainstream understanding of the systemic issues and barriers that exist in Canadian society, there's an opportunity to evolve how civic engagement is approached and for us to shape some new norms for how we engage and approach political spaces. Most people in Canada, certainly not in my family or in a lot of the communities that I've lived in, feel understood by political campaigns, and they're often shamed or just kind of made to feel uncomfortable or intimidated or bored. So then they end up disconnecting from the outcome of an election, disconnecting from the leaders that end up in positions of power in their communities. And this isn't healthy for our democracy. And it's really important for our discourse to evolve from thinking, well, these are the ignorant masses. They should read a newspaper every day. They should be doing this or they should be doing that. What are we doing as a society to ensure that we have democratic competencies within our communities? That's a core social responsibility that we need to develop, and it needs to start when people are young. And I just want to give a shout out in terms of just Samanta's point about can people stop being threatened by young people's abilities? Amarjeet Sohi was recently elected as mayor of Edmonton, my hometown, due to the contributions of tremendous people, including his 22-year-old director of field operations, whose name is, I believe, Harnoor Kochar. I'm going to check in a minute to make sure we get it right. And she did an incredible job. And, what potential are we inadvertently streaming away from our democracy when we don't make space for someone like that? It's our loss.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think back to the low voter turnout in municipal elections, and when I found out how atrocious it was, I was like, all municipalities should have an action plan of how they intend to increase voter turnout and to also work with communities and organizations that are doing this work already. Here in Hamilton, the Disability Justice Network of Ontario, during the elections was giving out information that was done in Braille, right? Like, we don't have information that allows for any and everyone to have the information that they need. So this is how people are excluded. And until we decide to make that commitment, and democracy is not just about I'm going to vote. Democracy, that's like one I don't even want to put a number to it, but it's one part of the whole spectrum of democracy. So I think after the voting is done, now the actual work starts to create an inclusive democracy, talking to members of elected officials. What are they going to do on certain things? Here in Hamilton, we have a housing crisis. We have an encampment crisis. We have a climate change crisis. And these things, we need to engage in it, not only come election time, but after our elected officials are elected and they take their oath of office, because that's where the rubber meets the road.
I'd also, I know that there were questions, so I don't want to throw everything off, but something I feel like I'm also not really speaking up about is this like myth of neutrality in Canada, and how that ends up being something that I know from working in nonprofits. So I love nonprofits. I have an issue with the system in which nonprofits are forced to work within, because I feel like it doesn't make a lot of sense. And I admittedly don't know a whole lot about it. It's just anytime I've worked at a nonprofit, I've loved the people, I've loved the work, I love what we're doing, but then I've never understood why there's this importance around neutrality. But neutrality really, like, to me, is such a myth. And it's something that we're trying to dispel on our Instagram account, because you can't approach things around human rights with a neutral stance on it. And as Sabreena was saying, with regards to like mainstream awareness of the inequities that exist in our world, now the options are like either actively an ally in existing solidarity, or you are perpetuating like white supremacy and systemic violence and systemic harm. It's not, there's no middle ground anymore. I mean, there arguably never really was, but like, you have to be on the side of change and the side of progress, or you're and like actively engage in that, or you're definitely perpetuating a system that doesn't work for everybody. And as I think Kojo was saying earlier, like, that's not good for our democracy. The democracy that we want is one that reflects everybody, not just the wealthy, not just the settlers who have been here for a very long time. It has to reflect all of us. And that includes people like my parents, who struggle with criticizing Canada because they come from a country that's recovering from colonization, and therefore are lucky and happy to be in this country. But I think you can love Canada and still think that it needs to be better. Like, you can have gratitude and still be like, you need to get your shit together, Canada. And that's what we try to do on our grid, is push those sort of conversations. Yeah. I'm never really good at closing out, so I'll just stop.
I think there were a couple of questions in the chat about people running and women of color running. One thing that, at least at HCCI, what we've done is we had a program that was funded by the federal government. It was called the Hamilton Civic Leadership Program. And so in that program, we tried, it was a program that was dedicated to Black, Indigenous, people of color youth between the ages of 16 to 29. And we even had 12-year-olds and 16-year-olds. So we included them, we didn't exclude them. And when we gave them the training, we took them to Queen's Park. We had town halls with elected officials at all 3 levels, We spoke to them about things that they were involved in their community. And I think those are the things that allow for people to be engaged and to get the capacity and the training so that when it's time for them to run, and running is not the only thing. As Sabreena talked about, you can be part of a campaign, a volunteer coordinator. You can also be involved in policy writing. And there's so many things that you can do. But I think having the space to do all of that and to train and to practice and to make mistakes, these are the opportunities that we need to start doing. So I think those are some of the things that can be done to set people in the right path. The last thing that I'll say about it, I was trying to answer some of the questions together. I think what someone said, they're a woman of color and they ran this past election. I think it's clear, or I should say it's a fact, that when women ran, the challenges that they face are enormous. Whether it's issues around childcare, the misogyny, the patriarchy that they face within their parties, when they go out to knock doors or do all the things that they do. So one thing I always say is try and also get involved in community organizations that are in your specific city, because then now you're building a community and a framework for people to support you, because you need that kind of support. It's not just about you. It's not just about, the things that you hold important to you, because those things too can affect other people. So you need to find a community that you can trust and you can depend on.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like you were unmuted first.
Go ahead.
Oh, unmute privileges. Well, I wanted to respond to Harvey's question about, well, what's a response to all of this? And I see a big opportunity for political parties to raise the bar on how they manage their relationship with the electorate. This sends an important signal to other sectors, right? That's where a lot of our norms about leadership are set, is in the political space. So there's potential to spark a culture change here that can reaffirm, pro-democracy aspects of social media. To get at what we were talking about with Sambot, can we have some policy and culture changes in the way political parties use social media platforms? Doing so would increase public participation across a range of communities. We're talking about a lot of different intersecting identities here today, and there's a lot that parties can do to help people feel safe and seen when they're engaging in the political process. And to note that with Sambot, our intention was not only to improve the quality of the conversation, but also to increase accountability among political actors. And looking ahead, we know, for the Ontario election, but other ones too, parties are really focused on recruiting diverse candidates because it's an indicator of their relevance. So they're focusing on reflecting our communities. So for women of color and others who are underrepresented in our democracy, it shouldn't be incumbent on them alone. Unfortunately, it is, for them to have a really straight conversation as they're being approached and recruited and exploring these opportunities about the conditions of work. So in the online circumstance anyway, what will parties be doing to support them and protect them online? And how are we as voters also going to ask those questions and set a new standard for accountability from parties?
I have two sort of thoughts around that, around the idea of parties. The thing I wanted to run for office one day. Like I was like, when I turn 40, I'm going to run for office. It's going to be really exciting. That idea is now gone. I no longer want to run for office because I heard Mumala Kakak's farewell speech at the House of Commons. And that destroyed a part of my heart that believed in the democratic process for what it is. I'm not saying I'm like anti-democracy now, obviously, but like the idea that that the system tells us, run for office if you want to make change, and then you invite people, like we run and we get elected and we sit in the room, but we're discriminated against walking into work. And I say we as a person of color, but Mumalak is Inuk, and like the experiences that she had in a country that stole land from her and her ancestors blows my mind. And I don't know how to enter into that space and feel safe. So I've decided not to engage in that space that way. And I think something parties really need to think about is if you're inviting people to these spaces to run, to be in office, how are you making them feel safe and included? How are you hearing their unique perspectives and experiences? And I'm not entirely convinced that's happening right now. At least I know it hasn't for Mumalak because we keep in touch. So that to me is what needs to change there. But we're sitting here and we're talking about how the system has to change as if there aren't people in these systems that also have to change. If there's a question here that someone had put in about like, as a woman of color, how can I run? Like, what should I do or whatever? You're doing everything you're supposed to do. It's not you that's the problem. The problem are the people in the society around us. And in those situations, what we need is solidarity. We need the people that are running against someone that is being attacked by hate speech to actually show up and stop it from happening. We need white allies to use their bodies and their influence and their money to protect people of color in these situations. We need people who watched Mumalak walking into work every day being stopped to call, to demand a solution here. Like, it's not on the person of color to create a space in which where they feel safe. It's on the system and the people with privilege to adjust the system to make it feel safe, and not make it be safe, not feel. So I think other people definitely should run. Like, I'm not against the idea, but if you are, I hope that the people around you, as well as the people on this call, step up and exist in solidarity, even if they don't agree with your political views, like, because you deserve it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Those were really great insights. And thank you so much for sharing that with us. I wanted to loop back into, Sam, what you mentioned earlier about neutrality, and how a lot of nonprofits feel like restricted or like forced to work in a space where they are afraid or they hesitate to sometimes participate in those political discussions. But at the same time, a lot of nonprofits, their missions or for nonprofits who are service providers, the reason why they need to provide those services are exactly because the changes that we need on a more like systemic level or system level. And in order for that to happen, you need to speak up. And so maybe like wanted to ask the panelists if you have any ideas or suggestions on how nonprofits can, engage their communities or do more, education, outreach around civics engagement, or to raise the issue that they are working on and to foster like a healthy environment for discussions around those issues, like as we mentioned earlier, like climate change, affordable housing, like a lot of those discussions that happen during election season, those issues affect the communities that nonprofits serve. So like, do you have any, and this is for all panelists, do you have any ideas or suggestions for different ways that organizations can raise awareness or provide resources and educate the communities for civics engagement?
I can jump in on that. I think it's important to acknowledge that nonprofits are often constrained in what they can say or do because of their funding. And but they do have the capacity to make calls for things like data. So to get at what Samanta was saying, like, we encourage women to run, oh, you should run, and Gurbeen Bussin in our chat is like, yeah, I did. And it was really hard and horrible. And I don't want to do it again. And we really need to be responsive to that. And if we look at how equity is addressed in other sectors, it's not just about the recruitment, it's the retention. And so nonprofits might not have the capacity to measure everything on their own and track everything on their own, but they can mobilize and come together to call for, on this matter, political parties to share data about the candidates that they're nominating. Do we have standardized data about the race of political candidates in our country, in our communities? Are we tracking that retention? Numbers tell a story. A lot of times nonprofits are in a position where they have to sing a sad song. And then everyone's like, oh, that's too bad. And then then they just keep going and nothing, changes. And it just kind of feels like the same. But numbers are a really useful way for nonprofits to do this. And it is also a way that they can tell a difficult story to their funders in a way that can be neutral. And so that might be something for us to consider. And I think it's something that a lot of people who work at nonprofits understand quite well, is just the quantification aspect, rather than over-explaining, rather than having to talk about white supremacy and dismantling and these really complicated, threatening terms and structures that are very relevant. Sometimes starting with numbers is a gateway into a more productive conversation. So that was certainly our experience with Sambot. Everybody knows that politicians get horrible vitriol coming their way. And we just looked at one platform. We followed 300 accounts for 5 weeks on one platform. That is like this much in terms of what the toxic online political conversation is in our country. But it really resonated because we were measuring the obvious, and people were like, that I can hold on to. That is something that I can grasp. It's at a scale that is still shocking, but it's something I can understand and figure out and potentially respond to. So that's kind of like a way we've tried to pilot at how do we get into this huge systemic issue that is crossing into different sectors and looking at regulations and policies and culture. But if we just take like the tiniest slice of something and measure it with a bot, and all of a sudden people paid so much attention to this, even though it was something we've all known all along for over a decade. So that's like a consideration for the group, is just quantification sometimes can go a long way.
Yeah, just to follow up, I think there are a couple of threads here, and I'm going to try and answer some of the questions because we have limited time. So I think somebody talked about, stolen land, genocide on this country, and if we're going to be participating, how does that work? Well, I think for non-for-profits, we have to move away or start centering our work around people, right? So whatever your mission is, your mission vision is, try and center it around people. And as Fred Hampton will say, people power is huge. So when you get a large segment of people talking about the thing you are concerned about, then now you can channel that to enact the change or influence the change that you want. If we all acknowledge that we are on stolen land, then everybody or any organization should know the indigenous organizations in their neighborhood. Have you reached out to them? Here in Hamilton, 1492 land back. They had lots of work to do. In Toronto, we have the Yellowhead Institute that's always publishing work. How are we supporting that work? There's the Sisters in Spirits that are trying to address murdering and missing Indigenous women and girls towards LGBTQIA community. So you need to figure out how your work intersects Or I think it was Sam that talked about solidarity. How does your work how is it in solidarity with other things that are happening, so that people then, now we have that people power. In Hamilton, there's a discussion about urban sprawl. In the past, that would have been an environmental discussion, from the beginning. But now that's being integrated into the housing crisis. The fact that we're on indigenous land, systemic racism, all of the things that we are all dealing with. So at some point, the role for non-for-profits is, how do you act in solidarity with other things that are going on in your community, so that we can have some collective people power to enact and influence the things that we want to do. The last example I'll give is in Hamilton. After I shouldn't say after, during COVID, there was discussion about a just recovery, right? We said, hey, look, what does a just recovery look like in Hamilton? So there were over 10 non-for-profits that got together to write a report, 150 recommendations that we submitted to our city council and sent to MPPs and MPs. And I think that's also another thread of how we can get to that point. Sabreena talked about quantifying. Well, writing a report and providing recommendations is another way of quantifying. When you work with other groups, you're doing that solidarity work, right? And that's how we build the numbers that's centered around the people that are most vulnerable, most marginalized. And that's how we get them included in what we are trying to do as a democracy.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic towards this idea of having to be neutral around these type of things, because I think often in my experience, people working in nonprofits care about the issues, they want to see change, they're the thing that they are in charge of. And it really sucks that we exist in a system where the people who are community focused can't publicly speak about things without risking funding and all of those things. And I don't know the answer to that problem. That is beyond me. But what I think people and nonprofits can do is create a space in which talking about politics and engaging these conversations is normal within your organization, within your community, and in the work that you're doing, that you're, like Kojo said, centering the people. So when we create content about the climate for our Instagram account, we always center Indigenous voices. You can't talk about climate change without Indigenous leadership being a part of it. And we note that over and over again. We do not talk about the climate or anything that's coming up without centering that. When we talk about food insecurity on our grid, we talk about Black and Indigenous voices and leadership being required, because they're disproportionately being affected by food insecurity in this country. And that to me is showing, like, it's us reminding people of the stuff that they need to, like, the people who aren't trained to see intersectionality won't see it naturally. So you have to keep pointing out that if you put a Black square up last year, you should care about food insecurity. If you put a Black square up last year, you should care about defunding the police. If you put, I'm so sad about, if you canceled your candidate plans this year, you should care about the water crisis. These are the things that organizations need to show up with. And like, solidarity isn't like a check mark and you move on. It's ongoing. Admittedly, it's tiring, but like, so's oppression. So if you really want to dismantle these things, it's showing up in solidarity continuously over and over again, and not looking to yourself to be the expert, but bringing in voices and community leaders that are, and creating opportunity. Like, solidarity doesn't have to just be taking a stance during an election. It can also be like only hiring BIPOC or marginalized communities to do vendor work. It could be creating, centering and creating like sort of discussions about like diversity and inclusion in your organization. It's hard work, but it's work that makes you feel like your organization is on your side. Yeah.
Thank you. And something that really stuck with me was what Kojo said about centering people and mobilizing communities. And when everyone's talking about the issue, like the voices get louder. And I think that is something nonprofits are really good at, because, you know, we have a wealth of knowledge, like firsthand experience, and the communities that we serve, they have lived experiences. They're knowledge holders to those issues that impact them. So to foster those conversations is a way to, I don't know, like we mentioned earlier around neutrality, like nonprofits a lot of times feel like they are restricted and they can't do this and they can't do that, but it's actually doable. Like, think about how you can mobilize your communities, maybe how you can encourage your communities to go out and vote. And we also have another question from the chat that was asking about, kind of ties into this, other forms of engagement. So any advice for nonprofits who want to do candidate questionnaires, host candidate debates, or influencing party platforms, or simply to, you know, to lay out party platforms in a way that's in languages that's easily accessible for communities to understand what each party it's saying in the upcoming elections. So we have around 9 minutes left, but I want to hear from the panelists what your thoughts are on that, like advice for influencing party platforms and hosting candidate debates. If
Maybe I'll go first. I'll do it quickly, and then I'll hand it over to Sam and Sabreena. Yeah, I think, you know, partner with other community organizations and do the things that you want to do. Like I said, this past federal election, we did some roundtables here in Hamilton. It was in partnership with Hamilton Anti-Racism Resource Center, the Legal Clinic, Disability Justice Network of Ontario, the City of Hamilton. Like, we have to start thinking out of the box. We always argue with the City of Hamilton, but we still work with them, you know? Like, so it's one of those things where you have to be, you have to think outside the box. You have to work together. So roundtables, writing reports, talking to people in their neighborhoods, and mobilizing people. I think that's the key thing, mobilizing people so that when it's time to vote, when it's time to have a discussion, when it's time to do a rally, when it's time to meet the MP, when it's time to meet the councillor, MPP, etc., it's not just you going there, because then now you have hundreds and thousands of people. So that's what I would say.
anyone else, any other inputs or thoughts on this?
The only thing that I was trying to Google who said this, but someone said it to me the other day, and I can't remember who some famous person said, no one gives you political power, you have to take it. And I think that if we want, like, Canada is already a very reactive policymaker. They don't really proactively go like, you know what, this is going to be a problem in a few years, we're going to fix this now. They wait for public like frustration, and then they have to do it. So I think that if we want this country to be better, we're just going to have to make it better. And I know that sounds really like naive and like optimistic, but I also think there's power in numbers, and there's power in how many people want change. And I think showing up is half the battle, and normalizing conversations around political engagement and critical conversations about the future of our country is really important. The way that I invite my friends who aren't very political into political conversations is I ask them if they think that everyone in Canada should have access to clean water. I ask them if they think that everyone should be able to call the police and feel safe. Admittedly, all my friends are similarly leaning in terms of our values. Obviously, that's why we hang out. But they always say yeah to those things. And then I go, well, then you care about politics. And I think politics as an institution feels sticky. It feels hard to engage with. It feels confusing, but thinking everyone needs clean water doesn't. That feels like 100% easy to think of and like stand by. So creating these conversations that are political in nature, just because, and tying them back to that fact, but starting it in a place of social justice and starting it in a place of like, yeah, just like everyone should have clean access to water and everyone should be able to call the police in an emergency and everyone should be able to Google things now because we live in these times. You know, like menstrual products shouldn't cost $30 up north and be like $8 here. It like none of these things make sense, but they're political. We're all political, and like tying it back to that, I think is how we engage in it and how we create the world that we want to exist in.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, the hesitation that you're speaking about, Samanta, I think is like a big part of the problem. People just kind of self-select out of the political process because they think, well, you know, someone more deserving or learned is there and they're not meant to be there or something. And this gets at other systemic issues that hold back women of color from seeking positions of leadership that they call it imposter syndrome, but it's really like I'm not welcome syndrome. And it's important to push through that, because if you're not in that space, it's very unlikely someone better is going to take it. So just take it. And then you can figure it out as you go. Yes, there should be other supports in place. Yes, you don't want to be alone. You don't want to be the only visible minority, for instance, you know, at your job as a leader or something like that. You definitely need those supports and you need to take care of yourself. But the hesitation is part of the status quo. That's by design. And bringing that down, unpacking that is a key element to getting the political participation increased. It's also important for us to understand that there are many, many, many forms of civic engagement beyond voting. And it's not a ladder, it's an array. And so you just need to start where you feel comfortable. Is that, you know, talking to different family members about something, not in like a challenging, top-down, aggressive kind of way. Is this about listening to some podcasts? Do you want to watch a documentary? Like, where are you comfortable? Where do you want to shop? Where do you want to, like, what do you want to do in your life? Turns out it's actually political already. And you just didn't really label it that way because it felt really uncomfortable, but that's okay. So just keep going. And I think that clarity on the fact that we're already leading political lives, we make political decisions all the time, we're more than worthy, we're more than capable, is something that we need to you know, develop and hone as an understanding and as something that, you know, we can approach as a democratic competency.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. With 2 minutes left, less than 2 minutes left, if maybe each panelist would like to just use one, if possible, one short sentence to express what you hope to see in the upcoming provincial or municipal election in 2022. I would invite whoever would like to go first.
Well, I'll go with something. I would love to see political parties respond to our Sandbot data. They're recruiting diverse candidates to be reflective of our communities. How are they going to be supported and protected online?
We have about 77 people here. I would challenge all of you to commit to getting 10 more people to participate in both elections next year. So then that will mean 770 people, and then keep that 10 going and going and going and going. And hopefully we'll get more participatory politics and inclusive democracy.
I don't know if I'm allowed to say this here, but I hope Doug Ford gets voted out. That's what I would like to see, since you're asking. And just someone who believes in evidence and science to be sort of put in. But I'd also like to plug that if you're looking for how to compassionately communicate and bring an equity lens to the work you're doing, please consider hiring a BIPOC owned or a POC owned and founded organization called the On Canada Project. I hear they're really nice over there.
Thank you so much. Just in the end, just want to say thank you again, Kojo Damptey from the Hamilton Center for Civic Inclusion, Sabreena Delhon from the Samara Center for Democracy, and Samanta Krishnapillai from the On Canada Project. And thank you everyone for joining us. That was a great conversation, and I invite you to connect with each other using the network tab on FeedLoop and continue the conversation, exchange ideas and resources. And also at 4 p.m., we have the closing plenary session where Ontario's first Poet Laureate Randall Adjei will be delivering a powerful speech and spoken word performance on how design thinking can innovate and change the nonprofit sector. So we look forward to seeing all of you there. Thank you so much, everyone. And bye. Enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thanks for having us, Candice.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being on the panel. Thank you so much.